Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish. I'm Martyn Day and I'm joined today by Chris Stevens in the studio, a former Glasgow MP, and Fiona Grahame in Orkney online. Thank you both for joining us today. We start as usual with the Ukraine update, now on day 1012. A Russian missile strike on a town in Ukraine's central Dnipropetrovsk region on Saturday killed at least 4 people. President Volodymyr Zelensky said more than a dozen others were wounded, including a child, while a residential building and shop were damaged. According to officials, Zelensky said a rescue operation was underway. Zarchanka is about 50 kilometres north of Dnipro, the region's capital. Former UK ambassador to Russia, Sir Tony Brenton, has said President Zelensky is playing a very sophisticated game in calling for Ukrainian-controlled territories to come under the NATO umbrella. But he added that the Ukrainian president had made quite a major concession in stating he was prepared to see a ceasefire and then negotiate the return of Russian-occupied territory in Ukraine over the long term. Zelensky earlier suggested that Ukrainian territory under the control should be taken under the NATO umbrella to try to stop the hot stage of the war with Russia. Zelensky said that such a proposal has never been considered by Ukraine because it has never officially been offered. 1 child died in Russia's western Bryansk region after a massive Ukrainian drone attack, the local governor said today. Alexander Bogomaz said the attacks completely destroyed one house in the Stradabowski municipal district. The Russian Defense Ministry said its air defences destroyed 29 Ukrainian drones overnight, including 20 in the Bryansk region, 7 in the Kaluga region, and 1 each in Smolensk and Kursk regions. Ukraine came under attack from 10 Russian drones, of which 8 were shot down over the Kiev, Cherkasy, Kirovag, Dnipropetrovsk and Kherson regions, the Ukrainian Air Force said on Saturday. 1 drone returned to the Russian-occupied territory, while the final drone disappeared from radar, often a sign of the use of electronic defences. Ukraine has asked Latin American parliamentarians and diplomats to assist in its defence in the war with Russia. Representatives of Argentina, Belize, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Panama, El Salvador, Ecuador, Peru and Costa Rica came to Kiev for a meeting with President Volodymyr Zelensky. Police in North Macedonia arrested a Macedonian national suspected of intending to join the Russian army and fight in Ukraine. According to the country's Interior Ministry, it is the first case of a Macedonian national facing the specific charge. The man, identified only as JK, faces a minimum 3-year sentence if convicted. Well, there we have it. A never-ending stream of negativity, unfortunately, when we think of Ukraine. I don't know if either of my guests wish to add anything to the update.
No, not from me. But as you say, Martyn, it's just a very depressing outlook. And the fact that it's 1012 days, as you had indicated, and that's now well over 3 years now, I think is incredible when you consider that.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid there are far too many innocent people being killed everywhere in the world, and I would hope that our world leaders start paying attention to these issues in the weeks and months ahead.
Yeah, no, thanks. I think we echo those thoughts, and our prayers are with the people suffering on the ground.
Absolutely.
So, thank you for that. And Fiona, do you have anything you wish to add?
Well, I was just going to say that we're all in very frightening times, all of us, because now Putin's got his man going back into the White House. I think, the situation is increasingly concerning for everyone. No one can ignore it.
Yeah. The stream of negative consciousness, I'm afraid, continues with our next item, which is the update on the Gaza and the Middle East. There may be some glimmers of improvement there, though, although it's still very depressing. At least 44,382 Palestinians have been killed, and it's estimated that over 105,000 have been wounded in Gaza since the 7th of October 2023. More than 3,961 have been killed, and another 16,500 wounded in Lebanon. So I suppose the positive news is that this week Lebanon and Israel had agreed a ceasefire, and it will hold. Will it hold is the question, and will Egypt be able to make any progress on getting Israel to agree to a ceasefire with Hamas in Gaza? These are the bits we don't know. So, Chris, have you any thoughts?
Well, we desperately need, excuse me, we desperately need a ceasefire in Gaza.
Yeah.
On humanitarian grounds alone, thinking about the numbers that you've just outlined there are absolutely horrific and frightening. And I think that, again, internationally and world leaders need to step in and say to Israel that enough's enough. The Palestinian people are being subjected to horrifying bombing, and I would say unjustified in international law, and that ceasefire needs to now take place. It's went on for far too long. It's well over a year now. It's about 14 months. And I think that we need to demonstrate our solidarity to the Palestinian people who've been subjected to some quite outrageous behaviour by the Israeli state. We desperately need that ceasefire. I'm not as hopeful as some people, Martyn. We'll see if the ceasefire with Lebanon holds. But again, the international community needs to step in, and governments need to step in, and that does start with ensuring that there's no arms sales to Israel, and that should take place in the UK, and that should take place elsewhere in the world.
Thanks, Chris. Fiona, can I bring you in on?
Yeah, well, this is a genocide that's taken place in Gaza, and these numbers are a gross underestimate of actually how many have been killed and will die as a result of starvation, disease, and trauma. I mean, it's appalling that we're witnessing this on our screens, and yet world leaders continue to hum and haw about what to do. The UK continues to sell arms components for arms to Israel, which is an apartheid state. So I mean, we're absolutely shocked to our bits here in Orkney, and we've been holding peace vigils since October, every single Saturday, since October the 7th, 2023. And those demonstrations are happening all across Scotland, all across the UK, across the world, including in Israel. And they're simply not being reported on in the way they should be. So there's a sort of conspiracy, if you like to use that word, of the establishment media on properly reporting the public's reaction to this genocide that's occurring in Gaza.
I think Fiona's absolutely right about that, because she makes a very important point about starvation and the lack of aid that's going into Palestine because they're being blocked. I think that's a very important point as well, because that is also a tactic that's been used by the Israel state, but also about the demonstrations. So I was at the STUC 40th anniversary march against racism, and there was a huge delegation there in the march who want to see a ceasefire, who are pro-Palestine. And I think that I think clearly, I get the impression, certainly in Scotland, that there's a clear majority who's supportive of the Palestinian people in this particular situation. And I think that those protests are correct. I do think that we need to find a way of highlighting them as well, because Fiona makes the excellent point that a lot of this is underreported. A lot of the demonstrations, a lot of the the campaigning work is being underreported, and I do think that those of us who want to see a ceasefire need to perhaps have a step back and just look at the tactics that are being used, and just to make sure that we're getting that publicity out there and that people know about the situation. Because a lot of people don't read or watch news channels, they're going on with their lives. We need to continue to highlight this issue so it's in the consciousness of people, because I do get the sense that it's been less reported now than it was initially, and I do think we need to find a way of highlighting these things. So I'd agree fully with Fiona there.
No, I think you've touched on a very valid point. Are we witnessing some sort of public fatigue and just the negativity? They've heard of it before and it's washing over people now.
I'm not sure it's public fatigue. It might be, but I actually think that some of the news channels reporting and some of the media reporting on this has been Orwellian, to say the least. I mean, a classic example of that was the football supporters in the Netherlands, who, if you read some news outlets, were subjected to disgraceful behaviour, but the reality seems to be somewhat different. And indeed, I think there was a Sky News piece which you can no longer access and see because of that. So I think they get caught out with that. And so, I mean, I do think that we do need to... the so-called mainstream media has to be held into account if we don't think that they're correct, and if we think they're misreporting. I think we all have a duty to call that out if we see it.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Can I bring you in as well, Fiona, on this subject?
Well, we report it in the Orkney News. We've always been reporting the situation in Gaza, other conflicts around the world as well, but this one in Gaza is near and dear to people in Orkney, because we have close contacts with the Shufat refugee camp, which is in East Jerusalem. And now that the Israel Knesset passed that appalling bill, on UNRWA, I mean, all these places, these refugee camps, the West Bank, where UNRWA does incredible work, delivering humanitarian aid, on educational issues as well, getting kids schooling, really important things for the future Palestinians. And since the Knesset passed that, falling bill, all that work that UNRWA has been doing is under threat. So we in Orkney, we have that close relationship, as I say, with Shufat refugee camp, and we try and do our best to help folk there. What people have visited there and seen for themselves the situation, and can I just say that in all of this, the Palestinian people have just been amazing in their positivity in the most appalling circumstances, and they should be admired for what their reaction is to a lot of this as well.
No, thank you, Fiona. The Middle East seems to send no end of misery in everybody's direction, and we've seen possibly interesting developments also in Syria, where we know that Iran's foreign minister is visiting Damascus to support the Syrian government. The rebels have been making some progress, and there's been Russian airstrikes in northwest Syria, which perhaps looks like President Assad is being weakened, and whether that's impacts the rest of the region or not, time will tell. But there's
yeah. Well, I mean, you've got to remember, President Trump bears some responsibility for this, for some of his actions where he was in president the first term. Obviously, as you know, Martyn, we have a considerable and growing Kurdish community here in Scotland to monitor these situations as well, and certainly we'll see how that goes. But I'm afraid, the Western world has got to again take some responsibility for the mistakes it made in Syria. But we'll see how that situation develops, and I hope that that there'll be some recognition given to the Kurdish community in Syria as well, and that they're looked after, because they have been given the brown end of the stick far too often in history, and this was another example of it.
Thank you for that, Chris.
I think Fiona wants in, I think.
Fiona, can I bring
No,
you
I'm
back?
fine, thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to the next item, which is one closer to home, and that is the situation of UK government austerity. There's a new book just been published, and the book launches are coming up in the coming week, called Social Murder, Austerity and the Life Expectancy in the UK, and it's been by University of Glasgow. Experts have called out the devastating impact on UK austerity policies on life expectancy and equality. It's a pretty big subject. Do you want to say anything on this?
Well,
Chris?
I'm really looking forward to this book, actually. Reading it, it'll be stark reading. I think it'll be uncomfortable for a lot of people. But I think it's probably going to confirm what many of us already know and what many of us, when we were in Parliament, were seeking to do. And I think that there's an opportunity to, I think, discuss this and look at what potential changes we can make, because there's absolutely no doubt that austerity has had a devastating impact. Sorry, I'll just adjust this. The austerity has had a devastating impact on people's lives. And we know that, Martyn, when you and I were both in Parliament, we would have discussions around the poor state of the social security system, which is supposed to be the safety net and has not been a safety net. You'll know the work that I've done, just looking at basic things like, for example, the deductions of in terms of universal credit and all that does, and that perpetuates poverty. So essentially, people are being deducted from the basic minimum. You're seeing that. You're seeing the support mechanisms in public services across the range, where people are being manifestly kept in poverty. And I think that I hope that this book will start a huge debate around some of these issues, around public spending, around what kind of social security system that we want to see, and around some things like food poverty. There are people starving here at home. And that's some of the work that I'm involved in as chair of Good Food Scotland, where we're opening a number of community supermarkets and a number of affordable food spaces and affordable food clubs, where people can come in and actually afford food. And we've seen in our, to complement this book, we published a survey last week of around 2,000 respondents who are using those services in Glasgow. And clearly what's happening is that we know that 35% of people who are using the affordable food clubs are now saying that has moved them away from food banks, because we've now given them dignity and choice and doing these things. It's also about looking at the wraparound services we can provide that. But people are saying that it's improved their mental well-being, that 60% of respondents are saying that they're now able to get access to fresh fruit and vegetables, and then over 65% saying that they can now cook an affordable meal. Now, that's the sort of basics that we need to look at, and I hope that this book starts a very real debate around life expectancy and around the sort of society we want to see. 14 years of continued austerity, and some would argue that that's been continued to some extent by the new government. This cannot go on. You can't cut your way to economic success. You have to invest your way into economic growth and into the sort of society we want to see. So I very much welcome this intervention by the University of Glasgow, and I see our former colleague Alison Thewlis is going to be has given her insights into the launch of the book, which is happening this week.
Thank you. Fiona, I've not read the book myself yet, as it's just been published, but the summary for it highlights a dereliction of public health duty, which I think sets the scene, and Chris has elaborated a bit there on his experiences. Can we hear from yourself on this subject as well?
Well, these longitudinal studies are really important to give us a better view of the state of the nation's health. And what we saw when COVID hit us is that we weren't prepared for that because of previous cutbacks. And what we also saw in COVID was that the really important people in our society are the frontline workers. And I don't just mean the incredible folk in health and social care, but the cleaners and the posties and the delivery drivers, all taxi drivers, all these people are the important folks in our society. Um, and what we've got to do actually to address the real case of public health is to properly tackle the housing crisis. Now, you might not think that because you think, oh, what's that got to do with health? Well, it's central to public health because people should have a decent, warm, affordable home where children have space where they can play outdoors. I mean, that's a basic need. And I'm afraid we need politicians to, have the foresight, have the vision and the courage to take on board that housing crisis properly and to really tackle it, because everything else we're doing is just a sticking plaster. Food banks, fine, they're there as a desperate measure, but we really shouldn't be having them. So what we need to tackle, as I say, is the housing crisis so that everybody has a decent, warm home to live in, free from damp.
Right. Thank you, Fiona. I mean, looking at the summary of the book, it highlights cuts of an unprecedented level, and it highlights them in two areas: incomes of the poorest, and also vital public services that the poorest rely on the most. So it's a double whammy for those at the hard end of society.
Yes, well, you'll remember 2015, first budget, 3 billion from Social Security, continuous cuts in public services for as long as I can remember. I mean, when I started with what was then Strathclyde Regional Council in 1990, Martyn, I'm older than I look, but when I started in 1990, and I think throughout that period up to 2015, and even beyond, just from what I've picked up, local government was asked to provide 2% of, and I'll put this word in inverted commas, savings and efficiencies. And so if you look at that, and if you add up those 2% year on year on year on year, local government's about 40% of the size it was in 1990. And I think that's probably about right, actually. Yeah. You're seeing those sorts of cuts. We need to go back to, and I thought there was an opportunity to do this in the lead up to July. What kind of society do we want to see? What kind of public services do we need? And Fiona makes the really important point about housing, and that there's housing emergencies just about everywhere in the UK, but that does include Scotland, and in Glasgow it's acute, because what happens is that the Home Office put refugees, those who have been awarded status, then send them to the council. And say to the council, you need to house these people, with no interaction or plan or on any of those issues. We're expecting those who are seeking sanction in the country to live on £45 a week. I'll just put that in emphasis. That's what I was earning in the 1990s as a youth trainee, and we're expecting human beings, and no human being should be asked to live on something that a youth trainee was earning in 1990, 1991.
Oh, thank you. And I suppose it's quite poignant that this week the Scottish Government published its Housing Bill Scotland. Hopefully that shows that at least the debate is moving on to this territory. Fiona, would you like to comment on any of those?
Yeah, if you look at the areas with housing that's in the worst condition, those are also the areas where people's health is poorest, where fewer people go to get vaccinated. So the correlation is there, and that's what needs to be tackled. And it does need, a courageous government to do this. It's too big for local government to handle, right? It's too big for them. It needs a national campaign to really improve our housing stock. So as I say, people have a warm, affordable house. And then we can go on to a universal basic income so that we do away with welfare and people just get that basic income. Everybody gets it.
Well, I've a great I've great sympathy for universal basic income. We should certainly be trialling it. Fiona again makes a really important point, which I think is a strand that comes into this, and that's in cost of living and electricity, because and gas and other utilities. So people's utility costs and their food costs have rocketed up in the last couple of years, with really much government interaction, I would think, in terms of saying to utility companies or the supermarkets, you need to keep your costs down, and you need to you need to keep your prices down, because that has to happen. You can't have these companies bumping up prices and no intervention, but they're bumping up prices, they're making record profits, and people see that, and they don't think that there's much intervention around that, and I think that's why we have some of the political situation that we find ourselves in. We need to concentrate on the cost of living. We need to concentrate on the cost of living, what kind of society we want, and making sure, as Fiona's outlined, that people have access to a warm house, because those houses that are in poor condition are those houses in which people are scared of putting on their electricity on at night. We've seen this time and time again, Martyn. I've done events around pension credit, for example, and people saying to the charity afterwards that they don't put their heating on at night, but they wear a bonnet and they wear a coat into bed, and they do all these sorts of things. So these are the sort of issues in society that have been created as a result of continuing hardline austerity, and we need to confront those and confront the impacts of those, and that's what this book should do.
Yeah, no, thank you, Chris. I can recall from the days that I served on the Health Select Committee in Westminster, and obviously this related to England and Wales because it wasn't covering the Evolve, but I think the same pattern as here was that you could go back 100 years looking at areas of deprivation and health inequality, and the two are so interlinked,
Yep.
And that's where we've got to really tackle that. Fiona, would you like to add anything in, particularly around the north, the rural kind of issues?
Well, yes, because I am a person who lives officially in fuel poverty, like most Storcadians, and yet I can look out my window and see wind turbines, because we generate the electricity. It's in Scotland and in Orkney over 120% worth of what we need. We generate it here, and then madly it all goes south and we buy it back at exorbitant rates. So that's a kind of craziness of that system, and that needs overhauled as well. And it's not going to happen quick because too many vested interests making money out of that. And meanwhile, it's the householders that are paying.
Very much. I heard Greg Jackson from Octopus Energy again repeating his calls for regional zonal pricing this week, highlighting that we could have one of the cheapest levels of energy prices in Europe if that was the case.
Well, that's the irony. We should. The first thing that Ofgem did when the new government and the Labour Party came in was allow utility companies to bump up the prices by 10%. And so when government says, isn't it great that we've boosted the living wage by 6%, well, people just look at that and think, well, I'm sorry, I'm still having to pay for the basics of life. And we need a more interventionist economy and not the loose regulation we've got on electricity and gas, which is pretty ludicrous when you think about it, just when you think of what a precious resource it is and the benefits it can have, and the fuel poverty that Fiona's outlined, which happens in north, rural, and in urban areas. Fuel poverty, food poverty, it's all poverty, and it all starts from austerity, and it's why austerity must end, but whether it will end, I don't know.
No, thank you for that. I think that leads us on very nicely to our next item, which is about the Scottish Government budget, which is due to be published on Wednesday this coming week. We've already had one large ticket item trailed, the introduction of a new universal winter fuel payment for pensioners, which will be introduced from 25-26 year. and that adds to the list of UK government policies which Scotland is now mitigating. What thoughts do you have? Can I bring yourself in first, Fiona?
Well, that was an absolutely disgraceful thing the UK Labour government did. And those Scottish Labour MPs that voted for that. To cut the winter fuel payment. I had somebody, a neighbour, come to me and she's worried about it because will not fall into that bracket where you get pension credit. So I mean, it's deeply worrying for a lot of elderly people, and it was absolutely disgraceful that those Scottish Labour MPs, not long, how many days was it after they'd been elected, just towed the line and went along with it, knowing that they would have thousands of their constituents suffering because of that. So it's very welcome to see the Scottish Government doing that, but it really shouldn't have to. But it's doing that, and it'll come at a cost of something else. And again, I go back to my point about sticking plasters, because that's what they are, just to keep us going, just to keep our heads above the water. That's what's all going on now, and it's really time we all woke up to this.
Chris?
Well, there's a number of strands which Fiona has opened up from my remarks, but I think the first thing I think of it is really, really important now that the Scottish Government looks at all of these, highlights all of these policies, and with this poll which has come out, which has embraced a number of things that have been done, like free prescriptions, child payment, Scotrail nationalisation, universal education, free bus passes, all of that. This is about a key thing called a social contract. Every government should have a social contract with its people in saying that no matter who you are or what you are, these are universal things that apply to you. So if we ask people to pay more tax, it's because we want to keep these things for everyone. You get that as part of the social contract. You get all of these things because something can happen to you at any time in the future where you need prescriptions. And I've always seen some of the ludicrous arguments of it's one pill. I don't know many people who are prescribed one pill only, Martyn, with their health. It's usually a variation of prescriptions. And I still remember a conversation with someone at a door in 2011 in which they had said to me that if it hadn't been for free prescriptions, they were able to get all the drugs they needed. Because what was happening before then is people were picking and choosing the prescriptions they were taking. So if they were given 4 or 5 items, they were maybe buying 3 and keeping back 2 and then buying 2. And that's not the way we need to see things in a society. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, as Fiona's rightly described, was the gross stupidity of the British Labour Party coming into government and doing that. Particularly given that it was their creation. It was Gordon Brown who created the winter fuel payment, and rightly so, as a way of tackling food poverty. And given what we discussed about people not putting their heating on and all of that, there are pensioners who are in that situation at the moment because they just missed the line for pension credit. They don't do that. So I think that really, really important that we develop this theme that in Scotland there's a social contract. It's an agreed social contract. And that doesn't need to be party political, but our opponents, bless them, will force that to make it a party political issue, and that's their gross stupidity. But I just feel, Martyn, I've just got a sense now, having watched things from afar. What surprised me is how unprepared the British Labour Party were going into government. It still amazes me how unprepared they were, and it does look like that some of the decision making they made in the budget was Treasury officials saying, well, here's what we offered the other guys, and they've just taken that and embraced it without thinking through the political consequences.
Yep, I think that's probably a fair comment, and Rachel Reeves, with her background, is probably the ultimate neoliberal, carrying on the previous government's regime almost in many respects. Fiona, can I bring yourself in again?
Yeah, I think the free prescriptions are incredibly important, and people that don't live in Scotland and maybe go down, visit relatives in England or whatever, are shocked when they see, how much folk have to pay for so many things that here in Scotland we've now accepted, because our Scottish Parliament has passed it, that we get right free tuition for our students. All these things incredibly important. Just getting on the bus with your bus pass and things like that. And it'd be great if that could be then introduced for young people on our inter-island ferries, which I think is being looked into by the Scottish Government. And it's really important for young people, not just the elderly folk like me getting about, but young folk going about and socialising as well. So all these things we have in Scotland that we've just got used to. You're surprised when you go somewhere else, say visit relatives in England, and that's not there.
Yeah.
So I think it's good to remind people about these things, because that's the kind of society we're developing here in Scotland, and that's how we like our taxes to be used.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Fiona. So, just following on from some of the comments you made there, I mean, what particularly would you like to see in Wednesday's Scottish budget?
I think that I would hope that the budget looks at tackling the cost of living. That's what people want. It's why Donald Trump won in America, because as good as the Democratic campaign was, it missed out the key thing, the economy and the cost of living. You're seeing that even, I've been, because I'm a geek, Martyn, I've been watching the Irish election coverage, and cost of living is an issue there. It kept coming up, every politician was talking about cost of living. So I would hope that there'll be some measures about cost of living. And I do think that that's vital, and looking at helping some sectors to deal with that. Looking at some of the work that is being done around affordable food, for example, would be one example, and investing in public services, because we can no longer cut public services. It does very much remind me of the wall of water, and there's holes, and try to put fingers in them. At times, that's really basically what the Scottish Parliament has had to wrestle with. So I want investment, public services, cost of living measures, and to develop the social contract, because the social contract, I think, is important for many of the reasons that Fiona has described. Relatives in England want us to bring down the square sausage and the iron brew and the tablet and macaroon and all the other things, but there's also the Clear Start discussions that take place of, I need to spend money on X, and the Scottish relatives saying, well, that doesn't apply to us. And you're actually seeing some migration from England to Scotland as a result of the fact that there is universal entitlement to basic provision in Scotland that doesn't exist in other parts of the UK.
And that's certainly the challenge, is how do we put more money into people's pockets, which is the ultimate aspect that we've got sort of compare and contrast going on, because obviously the UK government's introduced its national insurance contribution rises, and we don't know quite what full impact that's going to have.
And that's a stark contrast to Ireland as well, with their budget, which Ireland is, and got a surplus, and they're now looking at how they can help people through that surplus, and that will probably have dividends politically for the existing government, except the Greens, who look as if they're tanking. But Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael seem to be, at the very minimum, holding steady. And I think that's because they have an economy that's growing with a surplus, and it just goes to show you what a small independent country of 5 million people can do, Martyn. That they can turn around an economy, have a surplus, and look after its own.
Yeah, that's a good message for people to witness. Fiona, can I bring you back in?
Yes, whatever is in the budget, it won't produce the transformative change that's really need to tackle the issues we've been talking about, particularly in public health and housing and levels of poverty. I mean, because we're working in Scotland with such a limited budget and controls put on it by Westminster on how we spend that money, and then that knocks on to how local government manages their finances too. And what we do in Orkney is we always look north, and we look to our Nordic neighbours, small nations that are independent, and how they manage their societies. And I don't think any of them have ever worried about what currency they'll use. But you could see there what a small nation could do to improve the lot of its people in public health and in these universal provisions that are so important.
Well, thank you, Fiona, for that. I think that sort of brings us in nicely to a point Chris touched on earlier, the poll that was published by Survation on behalf of Progress Scotland, which highlights how in tune the Scottish public are with decisions of the Scottish Government over the last number of years. Everything from free prescriptions to the Scottish Child Payment to ScotRail nationalisation, free education, all pretty much supported overwhelmingly by the Scottish people. So, which brings us to the big question, what has the Scottish Government ever done for us, and how do we get the public to recognise what is done and get more of what they actually want?
Well, I remember that particular political broadcast as well. I think it was Jimmy from Take the High Road that presented it as well, and I remember meeting him around that. I think there's an important point here though, Martyn, is that we need to keep reminding people. Fiona's given great examples of someone who goes to visit their relatives in England and those conversations. I think sometimes people take them for granted, and I would hope that what this poll is going to do is just point out to people, you do realise that there are things that happen in Scotland that don't apply elsewhere in the UK, and that it has been the current Scottish Government, the SNP Government, and indeed the current Scottish Parliament that has protected many of these things and brought in this social contract so that things do happen in Scotland that don't happen elsewhere, and that people do support these measures. They support. I think it's barking, frankly mad, the amount of public services that are in private hands, and I think that nationalisation of rail was one good thing, and indeed the British Labour Party has followed that particular example, Martyn. Which I think is right. The fact that you do, once you have contributed to society, that when you're a pensioner, when you're older, you get free transport, that you get that you're going to maintain getting some sort of payment for your winter fuel. Basic things like, for example, business rates as well that actually help the smaller shopkeeper, and I think that's really important in economic terms. When you have more and more people buying online, and certainly we're doing that in the pandemic, and I think that since the pandemic people have just decided to continue to do that, that's had huge impact on local stores and shops that you would find in a normal high street in any town, village or city in Scotland. That it's the business rates has certainly assisted in maintaining these businesses, and again electricity and renewables. So I think this is a good thing. What the SNP have to do is continue to push that these things happen, and it's because of the SNP that these things are happening. I just feel that sometimes people take them for granted, and they shouldn't take them for granted, because we're already seeing debates brought about by the right wing, so-called mainstream media of the right, who are saying that the Scottish Government should be looking at these things. They should be looking at rolling back in free prescriptions. They should be looking at rolling back on, for example, free tuition. I think that would be a disaster if the Scottish Government did that, but they're certainly being encouraged to do that by right-wing forces, and it'll be right-wing forces like the Conservative Party, some elements of the British Labour Party who stupidly push these issues, and I think a political party who I think at this moment in time is a very real threat to our politics in Scotland. Reform, what a misnomer of a name that is for a far-right political party. But I have very real concerns about the far-right support that Reform are gaining in Scotland at the moment, and I do think that needs confronted. And one of the ways we can confront that is pointing out through our media, through our social media, through our other channels of this poll, what it highlights all the good things that are happening in Scotland, and that everything is not as bad sometimes as people make out. Things are tough and challenging, of course they are, but there's a lot of things that's been done that are good things with good public support, and that we believe that there's a contract with the people, and a social contract with the people is the way forward.
Well, thanks for that, Chris. I'll bring yourself in as well, Fiona, if I might, just to highlight some of the numbers in case people haven't seen them. The issue of free bus travel, supported by 88% of the Scottish people. Free prescriptions, supported by 82% of the Scottish people, just to highlight two of the big ticket items. And I think Chris has touched on a very real threat to these policies, and also the risk that people are taking for granted that they're baked in, and of course they're not necessarily set in stone. Fiona?
No, they're really important, and I think they're sort of at the limits of what we can do without independence, because unless we're in an independent country, we'll not be able to tackle the inequalities in the energy system we've got set up here. So if we want to tackle the national grid as it is now, which is very unfair to the areas that generate the electricity, if we want to tackle that, we have to have an independent Scotland. We can't do it through the Scottish Parliament. And as I say, these things that you've highlighted are very popular with the public, rightly so, because they're really good policies to have. Free tuition for students, education. That's for our future. That's for our future doctors and nurses and academic staff and researchers. So these are really important things. But we need to take it on from there. So we need to expand on those, but we'll not be able to do that within the limitations of the devolved settlement. And as I said, what we do here in Orkney, we look north and we look to see what independent countries of a comparable size to Scotland do. And without even the resources we have here, our natural resources, which are outstanding. So that's what we need. We do need independence, but we'll only get that if we make the argument, if we get that discussion, keep it going with people of the positive things we've got out of this Parliament and how much further we can take it.
Yep. No, thank you. Thank you for that, Fiona. I think, we've seen 8 very popular policies, I think, highlighting that decisions made in Scotland are popular with people in Scotland, so why not make more decisions? Chris,
Well, that's right, and what we have to do is merge. I'm admiring Fiona's cat in the background there, beautiful, beautiful cat, Fiona. But what I think that has to be done now for many of us is to start looking at, we have to merge independence with cost of living, a successful economy, and the social contract. And that this is, I think, something that I would be keen to see the SNP develop as a party in 2025, is to start bringing all these strands together. Because I think that there is real success, potential real success out there electorally. I think it kills off and takes on reform. Because I do sense that the other unionist parties are pandering to them. I think we need to confront their arguments. I think if we can bring all these strands together, people think that independence. Yes, you've always butted in.
Always butted in. Yes, not meaning to be rude or interrupt you, but I think it's not just the other parties. The mainstream media is platforming them.
Well, so-called mainstream media, and I always use so-called mainstream media because you're right. That there's some parts of the so-called mainstream media whose views on some of this are openly racist, and they know who they are, and that their targeting of being politicians, for example, is quite extraordinary and disgraceful. So they know who they are. There are some people who will hide under the mainstream media banner who are not mainstream. We need to now articulate position and merge that together. I think that. I think my frustration has been over the last year or two that I think some of our fellow Scots see independence as some sort of abstract concept, and it's not. And we have the responsibility to make sure it's not an abstract concept, and perhaps talk less about process and less about the why of independence and why it's needed, and we need to bring all those strands together. And I think that's something that I'm keen to help out with over the next couple of years.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Chris. I think I would echo that. I remember saying at the time after the referendum in 2014 that we had normalised the concept, which I think we had done, but there's a risk that as time's moved on, people are not recognising the urgency of independence that they did at that time. Fiona, can I bring you back in?
I think people do recognise urgency for independence, but they've kind of lost hope and lost faith, if you like, in our politicians who I mean, it's understandable they're caught up with dealing with the day-to-day stuff about, constraints of the budgets are given and how to tackle these health emergencies and cost of living crises and housing crises, as I said. So they're caught up in all that stuff. But we need to have that wider vision, that hope. We need to give people the hope that there is something better and it's not that far down the road. And that other countries have done it perfectly fine without worrying about, pound shillings and pence or dollars or euros or any other currency they wish to use, that it's there and that we can do it because we've got this country that's abundant in natural resources, a highly skilled population, and we can do this just like other countries have done. I mean, that's what we have to normalise, that it's achievable, and it's achievable within a few years. We can do this, but the politicians have to take that on and come with the rest of us who believe that.
Thank you, Fiona. Chris?
Well, I think it's not just politicians. I think those of us within the wider independence movement have to do it and make sure the politicians do it as well. I mean, I think that we have to own the fact that, collectively we'll make success, and sometimes collectively we make mistakes. And we have to accept that those are collective, and we have to then sit down and sort all of that out. I'm fairly optimistic, actually. Despite what's happened this year, I'm more and more optimistic, because I think that we're still blessed with with our opponents. That I sometimes think that we are just so fortunate with the opponents we have, and we're blessed with the opponents we have, and I think that that's going to continue. I just think that we have a current government that's so unprepared to meet the challenges that's in front of them, that I think that there's certainly opportunities for us in the next year and in 2026. And who knows when the next UK general election is going to be, because there's now nearly 3 million people demanding a new one. So we'll see what happens.
Yes.
We can't tell the future, but I'm optimistic. But we have to be clear of the society we want an independent Scotland to look like, that Fiona has very has put quite excellently, in my view. And we need to just merge all these strands to make independence relevant, and I think it is relevant, and that to give people encouragement and hope, because and to make sure that happens. And those of us in the SNP have to ensure that collectively that we're doing that too.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Chris. I think the opinion polls are suggesting there's been a bit of buyer's remorse already since the general election, so opportunities are certainly there to capitalise on that. We're starting to reach the end of the show. Fiona, can I bring you in for any final remarks on this subject yourself?
Well, what I don't want to see is people losing so much hope that they stop going to the polls and they don't even bother registering to vote. So that's why we need vision and ambition from our politicians and the political parties that believe in independence, and to get their act together and to make it happen, as the old slogan used to be. Because we can't have people losing faith enough that they just give up and don't bother voting at all.
Well, I think sadly there was an element of that in July. It turned out was certainly a difference maker in a number of constituencies. I would argue Glasgow South West was one, but we need to make sure we have to continue to inspire people and to make sure that they do come out to vote and give them a reason to vote for something. But I think turnout across the range, Ireland turnout's down, America turnout was down. Got to make sure that, and that was a difference maker clearly in the result in America, was people not coming out. We just need to inspire and give people positive reasons why they should come out and vote. I think the union of the current UK is finished. And I think they know that. I think it's slow decline. We need to now give them a reason as to say that this slow decline is not as good as it gets, that there's something better to do, and to, as Fiona said, to look north, to look west, and to look at all the other successful European countries round about us of at least 5 million people and what they have done, that their standard of living is better, that their economies are better, and we have to continue to push that message.
Thank you. Well, I think that is a wonderful note to end today's show on. So that pretty much brings us to it for this week's Full Scottish. But before I go, I just want to remind you that Broadcasting Scotland depends on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We set our current fundraising target in April, hoping to reach 36,000 by the end of the year. It's the beginning of December and we have only raised 18,000, just half of our target. However, to pay our bills and survive, we need to raise at least 12,000 urgently. We face costs of over £4,000 a month, but only receive donations of around 2,500. We urgently need more regular subscribers, but we need to clear our debts as well. We are at crisis point and really need your donations right now to be able to pay our bills and survive. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter and please donate whatever you can afford. Thank you, and thank you again to our guests, Chris and Fiona. Goodbye, and thank you for watching.